Splinter Cell. What do people love this series for? For its stealth action? Or for the stealth itself? People still argue about conviction to this day, saying it was a great game. And that's perfectly fine if you like it. But it wasn't what the fans of the series were waiting for. After 4 years of development, it turned into a full-on action game, where stealth felt almost optional. And the co-op campaign was the only thing really holding it up. That was the whole point. After the failure of next-gen Double Agent, why did we end up with a shooter? But what is the stealth genre really? These days, the term has become so broad that it's almost meaningless. And if you ask someone who grew up playing the original Splinter Cell trilogy about it, they'll probably tell you the genre's dead. But stealth still exists in modern games, doesn't it? I can quietly kill countless enemies, hide in cover, track them through walls, and avoid being spotted by staying outside their awareness indicators. That's the thing. It all feels so derivative now that it no longer offers anything unique. There's no real mechanical depth to it anymore. In the end, it's the pacing that does all the heavy lifting. And that's exactly where stealth action began to separate itself as its own genre. But if you really want to understand how classic stealth works, the answer lies in the past. Before Sam Fisher was reduced to side appearances and guest spots in multiplayer shooters, before stealth games turned piles of bodies into the norm, a real enemy is waiting for you here. In 2005, one that will search for you, pressure you, and wait for you to make a mistake. Here, you can rely only on yourself. And on the dark, there will be no mountain of bodies, only a mountain of restarts. Welcome to Chaos Theory.
Oh, God, please!
Ready.
Thunderstorms make me nervous.
Right from the start, I decided to play the game on Expert. On this difficulty, the game punishes you much harder for any mistakes related to noise, light, or NPC reactions. But at the same time, it makes it easier to see which systems actually work and which ones still feel unfinished. And this difficulty setting is something we'll be returning to more than once. And what really impresses you in the early stages is the movement system. You have total control over your character. And the best part is that you don't need a gamepad to achieve it. Movement speed is controlled with the mouse wheel, which feels very convenient. And over time, it becomes an essential part of how you play, because your movement speed directly affects the amount of noise you make. Compared to the earlier entries, movement in Chaos Theory became less arcadey and much heavier, but at the same time, it allows you to get even closer to your enemies. And this is where the cover system really stands out. It lets you move past guards with barely any space between you and them. The degree of control over the character that Chaos Theory managed to achieve gradually faded in the later games, and starting with Conviction, it was essentially gone altogether. The movement is as smooth as it gets. You can genuinely feel every action the main character performs, with the animations adding even more weight and clarity to each movement. The most interesting part is that every animation was handcrafted, rather than recorded through motion capture. But then again, Chaos Theory came out in 2005, so it's not completely free of bugs. In some areas, the game has definitely aged. Compared to the previous entries, the level of interactivity was also improved. You can hack computers and turrets, break open door locks, bypass digital keypads, and deal with laser-based alarm systems. At the same time, the amount of interactive elements has increased as well. However, the portable binoculars make things easier, allowing you to hack almost anything connected to technology from a short distance. Each mission also has a loadout system with 3 options: action, stealth, and the recommended setup. I always pick stealth because it gives you gadgets that don't break silence. Because of that, the other classes feel almost completely pointless, unless you're planning to trigger alarms and kill enemies, which the game obviously punishes you for. So in practice, it feels more like an illusion of choice. And on top of that, The action loadout isn't always available because of the conditions of certain missions. When it comes to gadgets, around half of them are actually fired from the Splinter Cell rifle as special ammunition. The sticky camera is used for scouting the area, but it can also be used to distract enemies. And if an enemy gets close enough, you can knock them out with gas. The sticky shocker is surprisingly accurate, even more accurate than a regular bullet. And it can incapacitate an enemy with a single shot from almost any distance. The gas grenade serves a similar purpose, knocking enemies unconscious. But it's important to mention that it doesn't work on enemies with gas masks, and the same applies to the sticky camera's gas. The ring airfoil projectile is another non-lethal option that can take enemies down quietly. The catch is that it has noticeable ballistics, and enemies can visually spot the projectile. And if you hit them in the legs, they'll detect it instead of being knocked out. It can also be used to destroy light bulbs silently. But once again, its ballistics make it inconvenient. Because of that, I spent the whole game just using the pistol or EMP instead. The EMP is attached to the pistol. It temporarily disables light bulbs, allowing you to move through the mission without making unnecessary noise. Unlike in the previous games, you don't have to keep aiming it at the light source, which makes things much easier, especially since shooting always comes with a risk. We also have several types of grenades that aren't tied to the rifle. Smoke grenades, flashbangs, and fragmentation grenades. I don't think there's much to comment on here, because only one of them is really useful for stealth, the smoke grenade, which lets you slip past enemies. But in practice, you probably won't be using it for most of the game, and we'll come back to that later. And then there are mines, which can kill enemies, though personally, I never needed them throughout the entire game. There are also enemy mines placed around certain locations, which you have to disarm. As for the gunplay itself, firearms have an extremely strange amount of spread here. You constantly have to wait for the reticle to tighten just to land a single accurate shot. This was clearly done on purpose, to make killing enemies as problematic as possible. And even if you wait for that perfect moment, you can still miss, have the bullet ricochet, and end up alerting nearby enemies. Shooting, even with a suppressor, is absolutely undesirable here, especially when NPCs are nearby. And of course, we can't forget the franchise's iconic multi-vision goggles, which have 3 vision modes. The first mode is night vision, which you'll be using quite often to see in the dark. The second mode is thermal vision, which lets you see through walls at a short distance. Usually, for an enemy to show up in this mode, they have to be almost right up against a wall or a door. And even if you don't see anyone behind a door with thermal vision, the optic cable comes in handy. It also has this mode, and you can slide it under the door to check the room properly. The third mode detects electrical signals. It's only really needed for optional objectives where you have to find hidden microphones, or for defusing bombs in co-op. In every other situation, I basically never used it. It's also worth noting that the game is very dark. Without the goggles, you can barely get by, unless you crank your monitor's brightness all the way up.
Nothing here but ghosts and shadows. All clear.
One thing that strongly overlaps with the gameplay, and is worth pointing out right away, is the sound design. As a reminder, your movement speed affects how much noise you make. This was already present in the earlier games, but Chaos Theory took it 2 steps further by adding a noise meter. Kicking down doors, a missed shot ricocheting after failing to hit a light, even firing a suppressed weapon. All of these produce different levels of noise, which can exceed the allowed threshold. Footsteps are also fairly noticeable, and enemy conversations can affect the noise level as well, though not to a significant degree. At the same time, ambient sounds can mask your own noise, making it much easier to get through an area more quickly. This could be a fountain, a thunderstorm, rain, a firefight, or a helicopter. Every noise source was manually placed in each mission. But how can you tell when you've been spotted? How did players live without detection indicators back in 2005? This is where the sound design helps once again.
Who's there? I can hear you moving.
Because of that, you become even more immersed in the feeling of being a spy. The soundtrack is also closely tied to what's happening in each location. More than that, these tracks weren't written for the game in a general sense. They were composed for each specific mission in the campaign. That's why Chaos Theory doesn't really have a single defining main theme. A lot of people would probably point to Ruthless. And yes, it's memorable, but it only plays during the New York mission and never shows up anywhere else in the campaign. And if you play the whole game in stealth, it's actually very easy to miss a large portion of the soundtrack. That's because the music becomes much more dynamic when things start going wrong.
A pair of spectacles was found in the 4th floor men's washroom. You may retrieve them from the front security desk.
The most important system at the core of the entire game is its AI. It's another major step forward compared to the earlier games. The enemies feel genuinely alive, and the main reason for that is the way their alert states work. I'm not a programmer by any means, so this understanding comes mostly from hours of first-hand experience, and from studying a lot of gameplay footage. An NPC's default state isn't all that interesting on its own, because it's just following the routine set up by the developers, repeating the same actions again and again. But the moment it starts to suspect something, it enters a search loop and begins checking the area. The lower its level of alertness, the easier it is for it to leave that loop and go back to its normal routine. NPCs remember the layout of the level. They know which doors are supposed to be closed and which ones should be open. As they pass by, they can notice locks you've tampered with, whether digital or mechanical. They also notice lights you turned on or off, as well as broken light bulbs. All of this creates behavioral loops that the player has to learn to balance, because the higher the tension rises, the less predictable the enemy becomes. There are 4 tension levels in total. At the first level, the enemy doesn't make too much of what happened. It can be triggered by a minor mistake, like disabling a light with an EMP. At this stage, an NPC may check the area, or may not, and if they do, they move fairly slowly. The second level is mild panic. It can be triggered by something like a light breaking right in front of a guard, or by them catching your silhouette for just a split second. Here, NPCs start using flashlights or flares. Getting past them becomes noticeably harder, and they may also call in someone nearby for support. But they still aren't fully sure about what they saw or heard. Level 3 is where they start reacting to everything with gunfire. Even then though, they still won't trigger the alarm. At that point, it's usually best not to disturb anyone unless you absolutely have to. This state happens when an enemy hasn't had time to fully calm down, and instead keeps finding more and more suspicious signs around the area. And level 4 is when the enemy is completely certain that someone has infiltrated the compound. It can be triggered if they hear gunfire, hear a ricochet, or simply get a clear look at you.
I've been shot in here.
At that point, they will go straight for the alarm. Alarm buttons are placed all across the levels, so technically, you can try to neutralize an enemy before they reach one and trigger the alarm. But to be honest, I've never managed to pull that off, even once. What's most interesting is that any tension level can be triggered in a second by making just one mistake. Turn off a light, and if an enemy sees it, they'll go to switch it back on. If you make an extra noise at that moment, they'll run to the switch instead. And if they have some kind of lighting tool on them, they'll use it. As for breaking light bulbs, that depends more on the level design. In some situations, it's easier to shoot them out with a pistol, which of course creates noise, so the enemy may react to it, or may not, depending on the sound range in the section of the map. In tense areas with a lot of lighting, I often destroyed the bulbs, but in places where I had more time and didn't need to rush, I used EMPs. Enemies can react to that too, but it's still the safest method, because in that cycle you can leave them like that indefinitely. And yes, enemies are sometimes limited to specific sections of the map. There are areas they simply can't enter. This becomes especially obvious when you manage to break their behavior. That brings us back to cycles again, specifically the ones NPCs can no longer escape from. When their coordination breaks down, it can actually end up breaking the level itself. I ran into this issue more than once, and sometimes I had to do a lot of improvising after making a badly timed save, just to fix a single segment of a level, because I needed either to get through that area or to grab a specific target there. There's also a section in the Bathouse mission, which we'll come back to later, where the lights simply cannot be turned off, because if an NPC reacts and tries to switch them back on, the game crashes.
Are you trying to play with me? I can take it.
Aside from tension levels, there are also alert levels across each location. Compared to the previous games, Chaos Theory has 4 alert levels instead of 3. and there are no hard restrictions tied to them. The mission does not fail if you cross the threshold, unless the objective specifically requires you to remain undetected. Each alert level makes the level harder to navigate by giving NPCs better equipment and putting them into a heightened state of tension from the outset. NPCs react more aggressively to everything, and during their investigation cycles, they'll try to stick together. At alert level 4, their equipment can include gas masks, night vision goggles, body armor, and heavier weapons that can practically one-shot you. That said, there are also missions where NPCs start out already well-equipped, and at maximum tension from the very beginning. Getting through firefights between enemies who are already shooting at each other is extremely difficult. Their detection response happens in a fraction of a second, and on Expert in particular, the whole process becomes nearly unplayable. And if a level also has lighting bugs, you end up having to measure every pixel just to avoid being detected. And going back to NPCs in their normal state, each of them has a certain minimum distance you simply can't cross without triggering detection, even if you're standing in the shadows. And the problem is that this radius somehow seems larger for enemies who are sitting down than it is for normal NPCs. I honestly can't explain it any other way. The game is not without its random moments either, and NPC behavior can sometimes get very strange. At times, NPCs simply refuse to investigate anything at all. Other times, they awkwardly slide down ladders, bump into each other, and end up accidentally discovering a body. It's the kind of 2005-era simulation that is both impressively advanced and, at the same time, capable of generating absolutely absurd moments. Chaos Theory's level design is full of bold ideas, and there are often multiple ways to approach a mission. The problem is that many of those routes are difficult to figure out, especially since the game doesn't have a proper training level. Instead, you get a 15-minute briefing that explains every aspect of the game. But theory that isn't reinforced through practice tends to fade, and that becomes a problem when half the game barely asks you to use half of its mechanics. At that point, it becomes an issue with the level design itself. There were missions where I genuinely didn't understand where I was supposed to go, because scripted locked doors made me assume that I simply wasn't meant to go there anymore. A good example is the ship mission, where I got completely lost and experienced some serious dissonance. There were so many bulkheads and so many passageways that I ended up wandering around and breaking the mission flow. And a big part of that comes down to how awkward the in-game map is. At best, it only helped me confirm which floor or deck I was on, and even that wasn't always clear. Getting lost within what should have been a fairly contained space turned out to be surprisingly easy. I listened carefully to the briefings, but they didn't really help, because they just weren't informative enough. And not knowing the layout only makes the situation worse. I often had no real sense of where I was going, or even a clear understanding of what exactly I was supposed to do next. And that lack of understanding, again, to repeat myself, can end up breaking the level and triggering unnecessary loops that the NPCs can no longer recover from. Yes, most of the single-player campaign is made up of linear levels, but whenever the game opens up and becomes non-linear, it isn't always supported by dialogue cues, and that's when the problems start. I'm not against having to search, especially if I at least know which floor I'm supposed to be on. What I am against is having to grab every soldier in the level just to interrogate them for information, especially when not all of them can even be interrogated. And I'm against having to comb through every corridor, every computer, and every floor that I don't even need to be on in the first place. The funniest part is that every mission also includes optional objectives, and many of them boil down to collectathon tasks. Find 3 hidden listening devices, 4 microphones, 3 gramophones, ammo crates, and so on. I'm already trying to understand the level, and the game still piles these grindy checklist objectives on top of it. Up to about the 3rd mission, I was still figuring the game out. By the middle of the campaign, I had started to genuinely enjoy its staging and core gameplay. But the second half of the game turns into a mess of bugs and half-baked systems. By the final mission, I was getting really frustrated trying to play stealth around groups of people already shooting at each other. Because, as I've said before, that whole aspect of the game feels unfinished. And of course, there were moments when I was somehow detected through walls.
What the?
Some missions also feature power outages. Visually, the level appears dark and shadowy, but... And, after everything I've talked about, the Bathouse mission is probably the clearest example of all these issues coming together in one place. It's exhausting, tonally disjointed to play through, and packed with bugs. It was painful. You have two separate areas, both brightly lit from every angle, both poorly designed, and they barely connect to each other at all. They just run in parallel because both of them lead to the same objective. And the whole time, I kept feeling like I was missing something, to the point where I wasn't even thinking about the optional objectives anymore. And probably the most ridiculous thing you'll see in the entire game is the boss fight with Shetland's bombs. I spent 2.5 hours in the Bathouse, and anyone who has played through this mission will understand exactly what I mean. On Expert, the game throws everything you know out the window and crushes you so hard that by the end, you'll be begging for it to be over. In Chaos Theory, stealth works, but only as long as you stay on the rails the developers laid out for you. And after the halfway point, those possible routes through each level become fewer and fewer. And despite everything I mentioned earlier, yes, there are bugs, yes, there are plenty of rough edges, and in some places the game has clearly aged, whether in its movement, its corridor-like level design, or its scripting. There's still a genuinely original core concept here, and that's exactly why fans keep coming back to it even now. There are missions in this game that feel almost perfect, missions you can't even pick apart, and they make you want to replay them again and again. The game itself is slow, but that meditative pace actually works. You don't want to rush because you're constantly watching every move you make and every move the enemy makes, all while staying in the shadows. And where there are bugs, yes, you do end up having to memorize them, especially the specific levels where they show up, if you're replaying the game for completion percentages. Even so, the game has so many moments where it genuinely keeps you on edge. You really don't want to expose yourself or get caught. The main thing is this. On your first playthrough, forget about the tedious optional objectives that just turn into a grind. They're incredibly distracting, and if you don't know the level layout, you probably won't complete them anyway. They break the atmosphere, because on a first playthrough, there should really only be one goal. Complete the main objective without being detected. Stick to that, and forget about the percentages for now.
Very funny. You need to make your way to extraction.
Throughout the entire story, I kept moving toward what I thought would be the answer to Chaos Theory. And the thing that interested me most was the meaning of the title itself. I honestly believed I'd unravel that mystery little by little, through each mission, by paying attention to every detail and reading absolutely everything. But after finishing the campaign, all I could ask was, what the f was that even supposed to be? It has nothing to do with mathematics, nothing to do with science in any meaningful way. It's just some idiotic pseudo-philosophy about causing chaos so the world can supposedly become better. And honestly, how do you manage to make such incredible levels while giving them such a downright awful, cliched plot? For a long time, I was trying to find material on Tom Clancy's books to understand how they connected to the franchise, to figure out what I was missing, but I couldn't even find a proper place to start. There was barely any useful information. Then I came across an article where the developers openly said they hated the author's books because of their cliches and political views, and that starting with the very first game in the series, they had never actually made the games as adaptations of his works. That's where a story like this comes from. It's the franchise creator's own irony at work. The more cliches they piled on, the more it started to resemble the author's writing. What's even more interesting is there actually were books based on the games, but they were written by completely different authors. And on top of that, about half of the games that carry the Tom Clancy label have no real connection to the man at all. The name is there because it sounds good and sells. And the author himself was never interested in game development and never got involved in it. As for Chaos Theory, it's a continuation of the first game in the series, but the story here is really just background material for a variety of levels and gameplay scenarios. There's no clearly defined villain, and the main character, Sam Fisher, is trying to track down the people who became interested in the mass kernels from the first game, algorithms capable of breaking into virtually anything. And the funniest part is that we spend a huge chunk of the game trying to determine whether missiles launched from some country's base were fired intentionally or not. That's pretty much the whole campaign. Who did it? Where? Why? Were they acting under government orders? Because if they weren't, then World War III doesn't start. Trust me, the story is not what made people love this game.
That seals it. The missile came from here, but they didn't launch it intentionally.
So that's a good thing. We can avoid a war.
Get over here and let's get moving.
Story-wise, the co-op campaign begins around the third mission of the main story. There isn't much of an interesting story here, because Agent 1 and Agent 2 are completely empty characters who have only a single line of dialogue in the entire game.
By the river!
Is that what you needed to know, guys?
Affirmative. Thanks a lot, sir. We owe you one.
Welcome to the team.
We investigate a different conspiracy, starting from the intel Fisher found in the bank. But this time the trail leads us to a biological weapon that is about to be released. That's basically the whole story, and we never really got invested in it, because it still feels bland. The villains aren't developed at all, and this time there are no briefings or cutscenes either. Chaos Theory's co-op stealth was basically a first draft of something the industry barely even had in 2005. It's not just that nothing quite like it was being released back then. This kind of co-op stealth experience practically didn't exist. The co-op mode was made by a different team of developers, which is why many aspects of it, including the way the levels are designed, feel noticeably different. Compared to the single-player campaign, the gameplay was adjusted to focus much more heavily on cooperation and player interaction. We still played on expert difficulty. There is an elite difficulty as well, of course, but we didn't want to strip ourselves of even more gadgets. There were already very few of them to begin with. And when it comes to the gameplay itself, what changed? The pistol-mounted EMP is much less effective now. To temporarily disable a laser, camera, or light, one player has to keep aiming the pistol's EMP at the device while holding the button, so the other player can move through the area undetected. Its battery life is much shorter too, which means you're constantly calling out how much time your partner has left. The portable hacking binoculars were nerfed as well. Instead of disabling devices from a distance, you now have to walk right up to every server and computer you need to use, forcing you much closer to the enemy. You're given fewer gadgets overall, but in return you can trade them with your teammate. And since that creates even more interaction between the two players, the gameplay restrictions actually end up working in the mode's favor. There are also plenty of cooperative actions available to the two players. You can boost each other over fences, help your partner climb up to a higher level, lower or lift one another with a rope, or even repel your partner upside down so they can perform a specific action. You can also throw your partner at an enemy to take them out. There are story-related synchronization actions as well. I'll only mention bomb defusal here. I'd rather leave the rest for you to discover if you decide to play it yourself. Most of these mechanics are introduced right away in the training level.
A little help over here?
Your co-op actions are used throughout every mission, and you can really see how, with each new level, the game's environments start to separate the two of you more and more carefully. That's where the game starts testing how much you trust each other. The levels are larger and more varied, but they're also much harder than those in the single-player campaign, and some of them offer non-linear progression as well. There are far fewer side objectives too, but each one is connected to the main mission, which makes them feel more meaningful and worth completing. Because Chaos Theory already has so much interactivity built into it, the co-op mode really gets to shine, thanks to all of its teamwork-based mechanics. But unfortunately, the issue with briefings becomes even worse in co-op. You're left with only the opening dialogue and the written mission descriptions. And those descriptions aren't particularly helpful, since they mostly just outline the situation rather than give you useful direction. At first, I didn't pay much attention to that, because there's still the OPSAT, which lists both the main and optional objectives, and I'd already seen the first mission being played through. Even when I wandered around there, I still had some clear points of reference, like the office rooms you're meant to pass through. But once we reached the second mission, we started getting lost, and I could already tell instinctively that something was about to go very wrong. And then came the bunker. Welcome to the hardest co-op mission of your life. Believe me, not every partner will make it through, and you can actually just skip it and move on to mission 4. I honestly can't decide what's worse, the bugged bathhouse in single player or bunker in co-op, which is also bugged. In a way, it's the signature mission, since it's the longest mission in the entire game, and it was even featured in the co-op trailer. But on a first playthrough, it's not just hard to complete, it's almost impossible to even understand. The first half of the mission is non-linear, particularly during the section where you infiltrate the bunker itself. We got stuck in the lab. For 2.5 hours, we kept running around without understanding what the developers wanted us to do, and along the way, we accidentally broke just about everything that could be broken. We started knocking everyone out so we wouldn't trigger an alert level, stay alive, and actually have a chance to look around. We checked every computer and every door. On top of that, the level kept throwing us off with areas that weren't relevant yet but were still open, including an elevator that wasn't working because its script hadn't been triggered. After a while, we figured out how to disable the cameras and found the tape tied to a side objective. But the main objective still pointed us toward the lab, which remained locked. That was when I suddenly had an idea. Seriously, how was I supposed to figure that out? And I'm not even talking about the fact that the button opens the door. I'm talking about what you actually have to do to make the button work. One person has to stand by the door while the other presses the button. That's the only way to get inside. And it's such a stupid solution, because nowhere else in the entire game had we seen anything like that. And nobody ever explains that this is how it works. And even after we got through the main part of the bunker and made it to the elevator, it still wasn't over. Because Mission 3 is still an absolute nightmare when it comes to narrow corridors, where you end up having to knock soldiers out, since doing a perfect ghost stealth run without touching anyone takes hours. So me and my partner ended up choosing efficiency instead. We know the game penalizes you for killing, so whenever possible, we just knocked enemies out at close range. We also got stuck at the crane section, because the game had never asked us to do anything like that before either. I understand that they wanted to make the mission more varied, but there's a huge difference between creating an interesting idea with varied level design and throwing the player into it without explaining how any of it is supposed to work. I do not envy the people who had to learn all this back in 2005 without YouTube. Even after watching a walkthrough for our second attempt, whenever we hit especially bad dead ends or ran into that same dissonance again, we still ended up tabbing out and watching speedruns. And honestly, by the end of Mission 3, we realized we would probably have to knock out almost everyone there just to remove the randomness factor entirely, because our luck was consistently awful. It took us 5 hours to get through the bunker. If anyone feels like playing through it, I strongly recommend using walkthrough videos whenever you start getting confused. It'll save you a lot of time. Trust me, this is not the kind of mission you want to figure out entirely on your own. Too much of it is laid out in a very unintuitive way, and the game explains very little. And on top of that, let's not forget that co-op doesn't even have a proper save system, only checkpoints. If you quit the game, you have to start all over again. Moving on to Mission 4, we were honestly able to relax a bit, because compared to Mission 3, it felt pretty straightforward. The mission itself is very memorable, thanks to its set pieces and locations. It was especially in Mission 4 that we often lost visual contact, and I couldn't always tell my partner where to move anymore. I had to start trusting him as an independent player. But there was one moment that managed to frustrate us even more.
Good lord! You need to get that antivirus and take care of Kim's man. Follow Chu to the locker room and get the virus from the locker. God damn it, what were you thinking? Chu was our only chance. Now we'll never stop Kim. God damn it, what were you thinking? Chu was our only chance. Now we'll never stop.
trouble here. I could use some backup.
Honestly, at that point, it already felt like some kind of joke. The game tells you to follow a target, but somehow you've already failed because you didn't kill him in time. Going in blind is really difficult, especially after the second mission. A lot of the time, it just wasn't clear what the game actually wanted from you. You never know what the developers have prepared next, because once again, there are sections where you need to interrogate someone for useful information, but you have no idea who exactly can be interrogated. There are also moments where the game tells you to do one thing, only for it to turn out that you actually have to kill someone instead. And then there are scripted sequences where you spend ages trying to figure out what's going on, asking yourself, why are they just standing there? What are they waiting for? We completed every mission at 100%, though I should mention right away that 2 of them have percentage bugs. Soul 3 is one of them, and it's important to emphasize that the mission is bugged. Nobody actually gets a true 100% there. In the community, 90% is basically treated as the equivalent of 100%. The other is Mission 3, the bunker, where 97% is also considered the equivalent of 100% by the community. It's unclear exactly where the game registers you as having been detected as an intruder, but personally, I've never seen anyone get a truly clean percentage on that mission. And on top of that, we also messed up during Mission 3 by accidentally killing 1 soldier, which cost my partner 2%. We didn't bother replaying the whole thing just for that. At launch, Chaos Theory included only 4 co-op missions, but with the release of version 1.05, additional content was added in the form of 2 DLC missions, Headquarters and Nuclear Plant. From a story perspective, these missions are essential, because the 4th mission does not provide a proper conclusion to the co-op campaign. Before going any further, I should immediately mention one major issue with the DLC, the sound. If you start one of these missions and there's no notification sound during Lambert's briefing, no ambient audio, and enemies still detect you without any of the usual sound design cues, simply disable the native language option, and the audio will return. The most important thing to remember, however, is that these missions do not contain voice dialogue from Lambert at all. That's not a bug. Those lines were simply never recorded. Also, do not create a checkpoint while one of the players has the optic cable placed under a door. If you do, the game may bug out and leave you permanently stuck in that viewing mode. The final 2 missions were clearly never polished to the same standard as the rest of the co-op campaign. This is especially noticeable in the environmental detail, the overall level of refinement, and the missing voice work. Because of that, they can be viewed as something close to a pre-alpha version that was later released as bonus content. Yes, it is somewhat disappointing to lose part of the narrative presentation and production quality, but despite that, these missions are still worth completing in order to see the true conclusion of the co-op story. Officially, the story order places Nuclear Plant before Headquarters. Whether this was intentional or not, the developers listed the missions in the exact opposite order. Personally, I recommend playing them in the order presented by the game itself, starting with Headquarters and saving Nuclear Plant for the finale. During the early stages, we were honestly close to giving up on the DLC altogether. And to be fair, the opening of Headquarters is fairly rough. But as we progressed further through the mission, it became clear that overall, the level was much more complete than we had initially expected. Nuclear Plant, on the other hand, feels like a mission that never received the final layer of polish it clearly needed. These missions are considerably more demanding, and every skill you acquired in the earlier levels becomes essential. Trust between you and your partner plays an even greater role, as the environments constantly divide you and force both players to act on their own. Sometimes it even gets to the point where each of you has your own route through the level. You'll also be dealing with the AI far more often. I'll never forget the moment when, surrounded by guards on all sides, we had to outsmart an entire group of NPCs just to reach the central computer, while simultaneously dragging an extra body out of sight so we wouldn't lose our percentage. Once again, despite all its bugs and unfinished parts, I have almost no complaints about Headquarters. Nuclear Plant, by contrast, left me with countless questions. In other words, this is the story of how we got hopelessly lost once again. And the reason is actually very simple. This time, you do not even have access to a 3D map, while the level itself is considerably more complex. Right at the beginning, we had to split up and make our way to separate laptops. To put this into perspective, we were on entirely different floors. The idea of separating the 2 players is excellent, but not when you have no map to orient yourself. It often felt like one of us had already progressed much further, while the other was still wandering through a completely different part of the facility. There are also many areas where the game appears to place you in shadow, even though the lighting system clearly treats those spots as fully illuminated. We were caught by this issue more times than I can count. Because of that, we eventually adopted a rather radical solution, destroying every light bulb that got in our way. Then, there's one particularly bizarre section where the game expects you to climb a ladder bathed in sunlight in the middle of a crowded area. Press a button that shuts down a massive ventilation fan, and only then allow your partner to drop a rope from above. And all of this takes place on expert difficulty. How did we pull that off? And the laser section deserves a special mention of its own. I genuinely have no idea who came up with that. And after all of those failed attempts, we eventually managed to complete the mission with a full 100%. At that point, Nuclear Plant firmly secured its place among the 3 most broken and frustrating missions in Chaos Theory. And by the end of it, it had completely broken me. But surprisingly, when we returned to headquarters, the mission that serves as the actual conclusion to the story, it turned out to be the most stable mission in the entire co-op campaign, in terms of both NPC behavior and level design. Yes, I was still detected through doors and walls, but you could always turn off the lights using a switch or the pistol-mounted EMP without any unintended consequences. The NPCs we repeatedly distracted with sticky cameras behaved consistently every single time, without any strange or unpredictable reactions. We consider this mission to be one of the very best in the entire game, and on top of that, we managed to set a pretty solid completion time. The DLC is somewhat contradictory. The missions are unfinished, and one of them is riddled with technical issues. Most additional content tends to reuse what is already present in the base game, while offering a lower level of polish. In this case, however, I saw a sincere attempt to create something genuinely distinct. As I've said before, Chaos Theory was an early experiment in cooperative stealth, and the DLC takes that idea even further, with level design that feels markedly different from anything else in the game. And despite the lack of polish, I would still consider that experiment a successful one. And for those of you who are already thinking about jumping straight into the co-op campaign, it is worth mentioning a few technical issues. The first and most obvious one is the 30 FPS cap. The game is synchronized between 2 clients, much like what Ubisoft would later do in Conviction. The official servers have been offline for many years. The good news, however, is that the co-op campaign can still be played over LAN using Hamachi. Simply create a room, wait for your partner to join, and then launch the game. From there, one of you creates a session while the other connects to it, and that is all it takes. We were able to connect both with someone from my own city and with a partner from another country entirely. Naturally, playing with someone overseas occasionally led to synchronization issues, which in turn caused severe lag. As a result, the closer your partner is geographically, the more stable your connection is likely to be. There's also one crucial rule to remember. Both players must be using exactly the same version of the game in order to connect successfully. It is also strongly recommended not to modify the game or alter anything in the configuration files. For example, the moment I disabled mouse acceleration in the configuration file, the game immediately began throwing connection errors whenever I tried to join my partner. You can try installing mods on both systems simultaneously, or simply send your modified game files to your co-op partner. But if something breaks, you are entirely on your own. And yes, the 30 FPS cap does affect the responsiveness of the controls. As far as I know, there's no reliable way to remove it. At least, I was unable to find any useful information on the subject. Thinking back to our experience with Conviction, which uses a very similar synchronization system, we did manage to unlock the frame rate there, but the entire game ended up running at half speed. So the real question is there any point in trying to unlock Chaos Theory at all? There's also one mechanic that disappeared from later games: in-game voice communication with your teammate. If you spoke too loudly, nearby enemies could actually hear you. Unfortunately, we were unable to test this feature because it only worked on Windows XP. I was not even able to find any footage showing how it functioned in practice. The official version of the game was later patched to support widescreen monitors, although some HUD elements still have problems. For example, during IP address hacking, parts of the interface can extend beyond the edges of the screen. Because of that, many players recommend using widescreen fix created by modders. Personally, I chose not to install it, since it could potentially interfere with co-op connectivity. The single-player mode is intentionally capped at 100 FPS. After reading discussions on Reddit, I only found reports about unlocking the frame rate in the first 2 games, where doing so caused animation problems with pop-up windows. I suspect Chaos Theory's frame rate cap exists for a reason. What is most impressive is that Chaos Theory is still widely praised for its graphics. Much of that praise comes from the advanced shader technology it introduced at the time. In many places, the game still looks remarkably good. Even though some of the models are not especially detailed by modern standards, the lighting and shadow work do an enormous amount to elevate the presentation. And none of it exists purely for visual spectacle. Every lighting decision directly affects the gameplay. In that sense, the game was truly decades ahead of its time. At the same time, some areas still rely on static lighting to illuminate the environment, most likely because of developmental constraints. That's also where many of the lighting bugs originate, both in the single-player campaign and in co-op. And of course, the age of the game is still visible in the object detail and environmental geometry. My main recommendation is to use Shader Model 3.0. On Shader Model 1.0, character models can develop heavy black outlines and shadow artifacts. At the time, I did not realize that anti-aliasing can still be enabled with Shader Model 3.0 if you disable HDR rendering. Because of that, I ended up playing the entire game without anti-aliasing. Even so, I would still much rather deal with a few jagged edges in the distance than look at those rendering artifacts. Ubisoft Montreal had just 2.5 years to build Chaos Theory after the first game. The project was built under brutal crunch conditions, largely driven by Clint Hawking himself. Surprisingly, Ubisoft wasn't really the one pushing for it this time. The team treated the project as something they had to prove, not just to players, but to themselves. They believed in the direction they had chosen and remained committed to it, making sure the game never suffered from the same uncertainty that defined the original Splinter Cell. And honestly, it shows. Every part of Chaos Theory feels like the work of developers who gave everything they had. It reinvented the gameplay. It introduced a far more sophisticated AI. Its level design, despite all of its flaws, constantly pushed new ideas. It gave us what was essentially the first true co-op stealth campaign, and even today, it's still one of the genre's finest. Its lighting technology was revolutionary for 2005, and on top of all that, the game was packed with content, including a multiplayer mode that deserves its own discussion. I'll be covering that mode in a future video, and believe me, you won't want to miss it. And once again, despite all the problems with Chaos Theory's level design, I still recommend finding your own way through each mission. Only look up other people's playthroughs if you truly feel stuck, or if you can't make sense of the level at all. That's completely normal. Other than that, try to solve things on your own. That's one of the defining traits of older games, and of Splinter Cell itself. Looking back at all the bugs, even after the game's later ports, I genuinely believe it just needed a little more time in development. The scope of the team's ambitions was simply too great for the amount of time they had. But what happened to the series after that? Unfortunately, the ideas that made Chaos Theory so special gradually began to fade away. Following the game's release, Ubisoft Montreal shifted its focus to the last-generation version of Splinter Cell Double Agent. At the same time, the studio was also developing Splinter Cell Essentials for the PSP. And if you look at the timeline, it's honestly surprising. Just 1 year after Chaos Theory, Essentials was released. Then, 6 months after Essentials, Double Agent was released. Ubisoft Montreal delivered a solid last-generation version of Double Agent. But the version that was supposed to define the next generation failed. The gamble on graphics simply didn't pay off. Ubisoft Shanghai delivered a deeply flawed product, and because that was the version most people experienced, the series went on a 4-year hiatus. Then came Conviction, a game that looked nothing like the original Splinter Cell titles, and many fans ended up hating the franchise because of it. And this is where the publisher bears the responsibility for trying to turn the series into an annual release. After Chaos Theory, Clint Hawking moved on to develop Far Cry 2, and eventually left Ubisoft altogether. Over the years, there were constant reports about him moving from one studio to another, always saying he was looking for a new challenge, something that genuinely interested him. He worked at a number of different studios before returning to Ubisoft 5 years later, yet the list of games he personally directed remains surprisingly short. It's probably difficult to return to the place where it all began. Even so, there are still fans waiting for Hawking to return to the franchise, because no one in the industry has managed to offer a stealth experience as unique as the one Chaos Theory did.